They came for a little girl in the middle of the night, a bald, frail child they called Cursed. Her mother fought them with bare hands and bleeding knees in the freezing snow, and the man who saved them was the most wanted outlaw in Wyoming, with a price on his head and ghosts in his eyes. He should have kept riding. He knew better. But when he heard that child scream, he stopped. What happens when a broken man, a desperate mother and an innocent little girl, find each other in the darkest storm of their lives? This is a channel for hearts that still believe in the frontier. Lesson of this story. The bravest thing you'll ever do isn't fight your enemies. It's open your door to someone the world has already given up on. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button and let me know in the comments and subscribed. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Thank you for being part of our community.
The pine door of the cabin didn't just break. It exploded inward, letting in the brutal teeth of the Wyoming winter. Cora Vance threw her entire weight against the intruders, her fingernails tearing at heavy wool coats and calloused hands. But there were simply too many of them. 5 men, their faces twisted with the ugly, self-righteous fear that Mayor Thaddeus Boone had been feeding the town of Blackwood for weeks. "Get the demon child out of here," one of them barked, his breath pluming in the freezing dawn air. "Boone says the sickness won't leave the valley until the cursed thing is gone." "No, please!" Cora screamed, her voice tearing her throat as a rough hand shoved her backward. She hit the floorboards hard, scrambling instantly, but she was a second too late. They had Lily. The 7-year-old girl didn't cry. She was too exhausted, her small body completely hollowed out by the typhoid fever that had nearly claimed her life 2 months ago. The sickness had taken her energy, her childhood, and, most horrifying to the superstitious townsfolk, every single strand of her hair. A large man in a buffalo coat dragged the shivering, completely bald child out onto the snow-covered front porch. The brutal December wind instantly bit into Lily's thin nightgown. Cora lunged, throwing herself into the snow on her bare knees, wrapping her arms around her daughter's fragile waist. "Take me! Leave her alone. She's just a little girl. She isn't contagious anymore." "She's a blight on Blackwood, widow," the man sneered, raising his boot to kick Cora away. "And you've got 5 minutes to pack a bag before we burn this plague rat nest to the ground." From the edge of the tree line, a shadow detached itself from the heavy morning mist. Silas Thorne had been riding for 3 days straight, a dead-eyed ghost slipping through the freezing timber to avoid the main roads. He had a price on his head that could buy half of Wyoming, and the law was less than 2 counties behind him. His bones ached with the cold, and his primary instinct, the one that had kept him alive for 3 violent years, screamed at him to ride past this miserable little town without stopping. Then he heard the scream. It wasn't a woman's scream. It was the high, ragged gasp of a terrified child. Silas pulled back on his stallion's reins. The horse huffed, stomping a heavy hoof in the snow. Through the thinning pines, Silas saw the mob. He saw the woman on her knees in the snow, fighting like a cornered wolf. And then he saw the little girl, small, frail, trembling uncontrollably in the ice, her smooth, bald head exposed to the biting wind. Something inside Silas's chest, a place he had locked away behind iron and whiskey the day he buried his own daughter in a pauper's grave, cracked wide open. The memory of a small, cold hand slipping out of his was so sharp it physically robbed him of breath. He didn't make a conscious choice. His hand moved to his hip, his thumb sliding over the hammer of his Colt 45, and he spurred his horse forward. The crunch of heavy hooves on the frozen crust of the snow finally drew the mob's attention. The men turned, their self-righteous sneers faltering at the sight of the lone rider breaking through the mist. Silas didn't look like a savior. He looked like the devil himself. He wore a black duster that swept over the flanks of his massive dark horse, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over eyes that held absolutely zero regard for human life. Frost clung to the dark stubble on his jaw, and a jagged scar cut through his left eyebrow. He stopped his horse 10 yards from the porch. The silence that fell over the clearing was heavier than the snow. "Let her go." Silas's voice wasn't a shout. It was a low, gravelly rasp that barely carried over the wind, yet every man in the yard heard it perfectly. It possessed the chilling, effortless authority of a man who had killed before and was entirely prepared to do it again before breakfast. The man in the buffalo coat swallowed hard, his grip on Lily loosening slightly. "This ain't your business, Drifter. We're doing the Lord's work. Mayor Boone ordered this town cleansed of—" The metallic click of the Colt being cocked echoed like a cannon shot in the crisp air. The barrel of the heavy revolver was pointed directly at the bridge of the man's nose. Silas hadn't even appeared to draw. The gun was just suddenly there, an extension of his arm. "I won't say it a second time," Silas said, his eyes dead and flat. "Take your hands off the little girl, or the Lord's going to have 5 new guests for breakfast." The man looked at the gaping muzzle of the Colt, then up at Silas's face. Whatever he saw in the outlaw's eyes stripped the remaining courage from his bones. He dropped Lily's arm and took a slow, deliberate step back. The other 4 men exchanged nervous glances, their mob mentality dissolving into self-preservation. "Boone ain't gonna like this," one of them muttered, retreating toward the road. "Tell Boone he can come find me," Silas replied, keeping the gun leveled until the 5 men had backed away, turned, and practically sprinted down the snow-packed trail back toward the town. Only when the woods were completely silent except for the howling wind did Silas lower his weapon. He slowly swung his long legs over the saddle and dropped to the ground, his spurs jingling softly. Cora Vance was still kneeling in the snow, her arms wrapped fiercely around her shivering child. She looked up at him, her chest heaving, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of profound relief and a brand new, very different kind of terror. She knew a predator when she saw one, and the man standing before her was far more dangerous than the 5 fools who had just fled. Silas took a step closer, unbuttoning his heavy fleece-lined duster. He slipped it off his broad shoulders, indifferent to the biting cold that immediately sank into his worn flannel shirt. He knelt in the snow, his massive frame dwarfing the mother and child, and gently draped the heavy, warm coat over the trembling little girl. Lily blinked up at him, her green eyes enormous in her pale, hairless face. Silas's throat tightened. He looked from the child to the fierce, beautiful, and absolutely terrified mother guarding her. "Get her inside," Silas said softly, "before she freezes to death." The wind howled through the splintered frame of the cabin door, a bitter reminder that surviving the town mob was only half the battle. Cora scrambled to her feet, her hands numb, and gathered Lily into her arms. The heavy, fleece-lined duster Silas had draped over the child swallowed her small frame entirely, smelling of leather, cold pine, and the faint, sharp tang of gunpowder. Silas didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped past Cora into the dim, freezing cabin and immediately set his shoulder against the broken door. With a grunt of effort, he forced the splintered wood back into its frame, grabbing a heavy oak chair to wedge beneath the iron handle. It wouldn't hold against a battering ram, but it stopped the biting Wyoming wind. The sudden quiet in the room was heavy, broken only by Lily's ragged breathing and the crackle of the dying embers in the hearth. Silas turned, his breath pluming in the cold room. Without his duster, he looked even broader, his faded flannel shirt pulled tight across his chest and shoulders. He took one step toward the hearth to stoke the fire. Clack, clack. The sound of a Winchester rifle lever being racked shut stopped him dead in his tracks. Silas slowly raised his hands, his palms open and empty, his eyes drifting from the stone hearth to the barrel of the rifle. Cora stood between him and the cot where she had just laid Lily. The Winchester was pressed tight to her shoulder, her finger resting dangerously close to the trigger. Her copper hair was wild, escaping its pins, and her dark eyes were wide, feral, and utterly devoid of trust. She was shaking, whether from the freezing cold or the adrenaline, Silas couldn't tell. "That's far enough," Cora said, her voice dropping to a low, warning tremor. "I appreciate what you did out there, mister. Truly I do. But you need to turn around, unwedge that door, and ride on." Silas didn't flinch. He looked at the gun, then up at her face. He saw the exhausted, desperate lines around her eyes, the look of a woman who had been fighting the whole damn world by herself for far too long. "I leave now. Those men come back before the sun hits the tree line," Silas said, his voice a low, steady rumble designed to soothe terrified horses and panicked women alike. "Your door is busted. Your fire is mostly ash. And that little girl is freezing. We'll manage. We always manage," Cora shot back, though the rifle barrel trembled a fraction of an inch. "I don't know you. And men who can draw a gun that fast don't bring peace with them." "No," Silas agreed softly, his gaze steady on hers. "They usually don't. But I'm not here to bring you trouble, ma'am. I just want a few hours by your fire to thaw my bones before I ride out. You can keep that rifle pointed at my chest the whole time if it makes you feel better." Cora's jaw tightened. The silence stretched, taut as a bowstring. She looked at the ice crusting the stubble on his jaw, the blue tint at the edge of his lips. Then a small, weak cough came from the cot. "Mama?" Lily's voice was barely a whisper. "He's cold. He's—" Cora closed her eyes for a fractured second. Slowly, reluctantly, she lowered the Winchester, though she kept it gripped tightly in her right hand. "Feed the fire," she ordered sharply. "Then sit on the far side of the hearth. Keep your hands where I can see them." Silas gave a single, slow nod. He moved to the woodpile, tossing 3 thick logs onto the dying embers and expertly nursing them into a roaring blaze. He settled onto the floorboards on the opposite side of the hearth, leaning his back against the rough log wall. The heat slowly pushed the winter chill out of the small room. For a long time, the only sound was the popping of the sap in the firewood. Cora sat rigidly on the edge of the cot, rubbing Lily's frozen feet, her eyes darting to Silas every few seconds. Lily, however, was watching the stranger with the unabashed, piercing curiosity of a child. She had wriggled her arms out of the massive sleeves of Silas's duster, clutching the collar around her neck. "You have a scar on your face," Lily stated matter-of-factly, her green eyes locked on his left eyebrow. "Did Mayor Boone's men do that?" "Lily, hush," Cora reprimanded softly, casting a nervous glance at Silas. But Silas didn't look offended. He looked at the little girl, and the dangerous, flat emptiness in his eyes melted away, replaced by a profound, haunting sadness. "No, little bird," Silas answered, his voice impossibly gentle. "A wild Mustang gave me this one a long time ago. I was trying to saddle him before he was ready." Lily tilted her head. She reached up with one thin hand and touched her own completely smooth, hairless scalp. It was a gesture of deep insecurity. One Cora knew broke her daughter's heart daily. "The town says I look like a monster," Lily whispered, her lower lip trembling. "They say I'm cursed." Cora sucked in a sharp breath, her heart twisting, ready to defend her daughter from the stranger's judgment. She waited for the flinch, the look of pity or disgust that every person in Blackwood gave Lily. It never came. Silas looked directly at Lily's bald head. He didn't look away, and he didn't offer a hollow, pitying lie. Instead, a slow, solemn smile touched the corner of his mouth. "I've seen a lot of monsters in my time, little bird," Silas said quietly, his eyes holding hers with absolute sincerity. "And none of them looked anything like you. I think you look like a survivor. And surviving is the bravest thing a person can do." Cora stared at him, stunned. The knot of defensive rage in her chest suddenly loosened, replaced by a strange, heavy warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. For the first time, she looked past the lethal speed of his gun hand and saw the shattered, beating heart beneath his ribs. Lily smiled, a genuine, tired little smile, and snuggled deeper into the heavy black duster. As she shifted, a folded piece of thick, yellowed paper slipped from the coat's deep inside pocket and fluttered to the floorboards. It landed near Cora's boots. Silas's posture stiffened instantly. The relaxed cowboy vanished, replaced once again by the coiled, dangerous drifter. Cora noticed the shift. Frowning, she kept her hand on her rifle as she bent down and picked up the paper. She unfolded it, holding it up to the firelight. Her breath hitched in her throat. Staring back at her was a sketch of the exact face sitting across the hearth from her. The scar through the eyebrow. The cold, dangerous eyes. Wanted dead or alive. Silas Thorne. Reward: $5,000 for armed robbery and murder. Cora's blood ran ice cold. $5,000. That wasn't the bounty of a petty thief. That was the price on the head of a ghost, a legend, the most dangerous outlaw in the territory. She slowly lowered the paper, her dark eyes locking with his. Silas hadn't moved. He sat perfectly still, watching her process the information, waiting to see if she would raise that Winchester again. He was the monster the world was hunting. But as the wind screamed against the cabin walls, Cora realized with a terrifying jolt that this wanted killer was the only thing standing between her family and the righteous men of Blackwood. The yellowed wanted poster felt as heavy as an anvil in Cora's trembling hand. Dead or alive. Silas Thorne. She looked from the crude ink drawing to the man sitting across the hearth. Silas hadn't moved a muscle. His hands rested loosely on his knees, his face an unreadable mask carved from stone. He was giving her the space to make a choice: raise the Winchester, or accept the devil into her home. Murder, Cora whispered, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. Depends on who's writing the laws, Mrs. Vance, Silas replied, his voice a low, gravelly scrape that offered no apologies and asked for no pity. But the bounty is real, and the men hunting me don't care who gets caught in the crossfire. Cora's eyes flicked to Lily. The little girl was fast asleep, buried under the massive dark duster, her breathing finally evening out in the lingering warmth of the room. Cora looked back at the poster, then at the dying embers in the hearth. The last log was burning down to a fragile, glowing skeleton. She carefully folded the paper and slipped it into her apron pocket. She didn't raise the rifle. The fire is dying, Cora said, her voice hollow, and we have no more wood. Silas frowned, his gaze sweeping the small, bare cabin. Where's your supply? Mayor Boone owns the timber mill, and he owns the men who run the freight, Cora explained, wrapping her arms around her waist as the draft began to bite at her ankles again. He ordered them to stop delivering to me last week. Said my coin was cursed. I chopped what I could from the deadfall out back, but the storm buried the rest. She closed her eyes, fighting a wave of crushing despair. If the temperature drops tonight like it did yesterday, the cold will take Lily before morning. Silas looked at the sleeping child, and the muscle in his jaw feathered. Without a word, he stood up. He walked over to the cot, looking down at his heavy duster. He didn't take it. Instead, he pulled a thin, worn wool blanket from his saddlebag near the door and wrapped it tightly around his broad shoulders. Cora's heart gave a strange, panicked lurch. Where are you going? To get wood. You can't, she argued, stepping toward him. It's a whiteout out there, and if Boone's men see you— I'm Silas Thorne, Mrs. Vance, he interrupted softly, pausing with his hand on the broken door. He looked over his shoulder, the ghost of a dark, reckless smirk touching his lips. Taking things that don't belong to me is what I do best. Before she could stop him, he shoved the door open and slipped out into the howling white maw of the blizzard. The storm was a living, screaming entity. Silas waded through snowdrifts that reached his thighs, his face completely numb, his eyelashes freezing together. The wind felt like broken glass against his skin. He didn't take his horse. The beast would make too much noise, and Silas needed the element of surprise. He trudged the half-mile into the edge of Blackwood, moving like a phantom through the blinding white. He found the town's communal woodpile behind the general store, covered by a heavy tarp. Two of Boone's hired thugs were huddled near the back door, sharing a bottle of cheap whiskey to stay warm, tasked with guarding the supplies from scavengers. Silas didn't give them a chance to draw. He materialized from the blizzard like a vengeful spirit. A swift, brutal strike with the heavy steel barrel of his Colt to the first man's temple dropped him instantly. The second man barely had time to widen his eyes before Silas's gloved fist shattered his nose, sending him collapsing into the snowbank, out cold. Breathing heavily, his lungs burning from the icy air, Silas loaded a heavy iron pull sled with as many split oak logs as it could hold. The walk back was agonizing. Every step was a battle against the rising snow and his own failing body heat. His thin wool blanket was useless against the Wyoming winter. By the time the dark outline of Cora's cabin appeared through the squall, Silas couldn't feel his hands or his feet. His vision was tunneling, the edges turning a fuzzy, dark gray. "Just keep moving," he ordered himself. "The little bird needs the fire." Cora had been pacing the floorboards for an hour, the Winchester clutched in her hands, her mind racing with a terrifying certainty that the outlaw was dead, frozen somewhere in the pines. Suddenly, the door violently shoved open. Silas stumbled inside, dragging a massive sled of oak behind him. He kicked the door shut, wedged the chair under the handle with the last ounce of his strength, and then his knees buckled. He collapsed onto the floorboards, a mountain of snow and ice falling with him. "Silas!" Cora dropped the rifle and fell to her knees beside him. He was shaking violently, his teeth chattering so hard they sounded like cracking stones. His lips were a terrifying shade of blue, and his skin was ice-cold to the touch. Hypothermia had set its lethal hooks into him. I got the wood," he slurred, his eyes half closed, struggling to focus on her face. "You stubborn, reckless fool," Cora choked out, her hands flying over his frozen clothes. Panic clawed at her throat, but the hardened frontier woman took over. She had to get him warm immediately or his heart would stop. She scrambled to the sled, throwing 3 large logs into the hearth, coaxing the dying embers back into a desperate, roaring blaze. Then she turned back to Silas. "You have to get these wet clothes off," she ordered, pulling at his frozen blanket. Silas's hands were useless, curled into stiff claws. Cora didn't hesitate. She unbuttoned his soaked flannel shirt, her knuckles brushing against his freezing skin. When she peeled the fabric back, she gasped. His torso was a map of violence. Pale, puckered scars from bullets and blades crisscrossed his heavily muscled chest and abdomen. But right now, that powerful body was failing him, racked by uncontrollable tremors. She managed to get his boots off, dragging him closer to the roaring fire. But the ambient heat wasn't enough. The violent shivering was tearing his remaining energy apart. Cora looked at her sleeping daughter, warm and safe under his coat. She looked at the wanted poster sticking out of her apron pocket. Then she looked at the dying outlaw on her floor. She made her choice. Cora unbuttoned the high collar of her own heavy woolen dress, loosening the bodice. She lay down on the floorboards right beside him, pressing the length of her body against his bare, freezing back. She wrapped her arms around his broad chest, pulling him tight against her, enveloping him in her own trapped body heat. Silas went rigid at the contact. Even through the haze of hypothermia, the shock of a woman's soft, warm body pressing so intimately against his scarred skin jolted his senses. "Shh," Cora whispered fiercely, her breath hot against the frozen shell of his ear. "Don't fight it. Just let the warmth in." For the first few minutes, the cold radiating off him was agonizing. But Cora held on, anchoring him to the world of the living. Slowly, agonizingly, the violent tremors began to subside. The ice in his hair melted, dripping onto the floorboards. As Silas's core temperature began to rise, the desperate survival instinct faded, leaving behind an incredibly charged, heavy awareness. He was acutely conscious of the soft press of her breasts against his back, the steady, frantic beating of her heart against his spine, and the scent of lye soap and dried lavender in her hair. It had been years since Silas had been touched with anything other than violence. The absolute vulnerability of the moment, the trust she was placing in a wanted killer to save his life, cracked something deep and foundational inside his chest. He turned his head slightly, his cheek rough with stubble, brushing against her arm. His hand, finally regaining feeling, slowly moved up to cover her smaller hand where it rested over his heart. His long, calloused fingers tangled loosely with hers. "You shouldn't trust me, Cora," he rasped, his voice raw with exhaustion and a sudden dangerous hunger. Cora's breath hitched in the quiet, firelit room. She didn't pull away. Instead, her grip on his hand tightened. "I don't trust Silas Thorne, the outlaw," she whispered back into the dark. "But I think I trust the man who almost froze to death to keep my daughter warm." Outside, the blizzard raged on, burying the town of Blackwood in ice. But inside the cabin, surrounded by the scent of wood smoke and the dangerous heat of the man in her arms, Cora Vance felt a spark ignite that terrified her far more than any storm. The wind did not howl through the Wyoming Valley. It screamed, a sustained, agonizing shriek of a world being torn apart by ice. Inside the Blackwood saloon, the air was thick with the stench of stale beer, damp wool, and the sour sweat of fearful men. The storm had trapped half the town's male population inside the tavern, the blizzard piling drifts against the frosted windows so high that the midday sun was choked down to a sickly, bruised twilight. Sitting in the darkest corner of the room, his back pressed flush against the rough-hewn timber wall, Gideon Cross slowly rotated a shot glass of cheap rye between his calloused fingers. He didn't drink it. He simply watched the amber liquid catch the meager light of the kerosene lamps overhead. Gideon was a man who looked exactly like the life he had led. Hard, weathered, and entirely stripped of illusions. He wore a gray wool coat that had seen better decades, a flat-brimmed Stetson pulled low over eyes the color of slate, and a neatly trimmed, silver-streaked beard that hid a jawline carved from granite. Once, a silver star had been pinned to his chest. Now, the only silver he cared about came in the form of bounty payouts. The heavy double doors of the saloon banged open, letting in a swirl of blinding white snow and two men who looked like they had just lost a fight with a freight train. The saloon went dead silent as the men shoved the doors shut and leaned against them, chest heaving. One of them, a hulking brute in a torn buffalo coat, was clutching a blood-soaked rag to his nose. It was shattered, swollen to the size of a plum, both of his eyes already bruising into a vibrant, sickly purple. His companion looked worse, favoring his right leg and sporting a massive, angry welt across his temple. These were Mayor Thaddeus Boone's men. Everyone in Blackwood knew them, and everyone feared them, except Gideon. "Get Boone!" The man with the broken nose snarled at the terrified bartender, his voice a wet, nasal wheeze. "Tell him the widow's got a guard dog, a big one." Gideon's slate-gray eyes snapped into focus. He set the shot glass down. "What happened to you, Miller?" a ranch hand near the bar asked, his voice trembling. "Did the Vance woman shoot you?" "Ain't no woman hits like that," Miller spat, tossing the bloody rag onto the floorboards. "It was a man, dressed all in black, moved like a goddamn shadow. Came out of the blizzard while we was guarding the town woodpile, took us both down before we could even clear leather, and stole a sled of oak. Dragged it right back out toward the widow's cabin." Whispers erupted across the saloon. A stranger? In this storm? Gideon leaned forward, the wooden chair creaking in protest. "Dressed in black," he said, his voice cutting through the rising panic of the room like a razor blade. It wasn't loud, but it carried a deadly weight that made the men around the bar instinctively step back. "Big man, moved fast. Did you happen to catch a look at his face, Miller?" Miller narrowed his bruised eyes at the bounty hunter. "Who's asking?" Gideon stood up. He wasn't the tallest man in the room, but he carried himself with an effortless, predatory grace that made him seem twice his size. He walked over to the bar, his boots heavy on the floorboards, and stopped inches from Miller. "I'm the man who's going to find the fellow who broke your face," Gideon said smoothly. "Now, did he have a scar? Left side, cutting straight through the eyebrow?" Miller blinked, visibly unnerved by the absolute dead calm in Gideon's gaze. "Yeah," the thug mumbled, swallowing hard. "Yeah, he did. Looked like a wildcat clawed him." A slow, grim smile touched the corner of Gideon's mouth. It didn't reach his eyes. Silas Thorne. Gideon had been tracking the Phantom of the Frontier for 8 grueling months, across 4 territories through mud, rain, and now a blizzard that was threatening to bury them all. Thorne was a ghost, a myth whispered around campfires. A man who had robbed the largest Union Pacific train completely solo, taken $50,000 of Thaddeus Boone's money, and vanished into thin air. The bounty was $5,000. Enough for Gideon to buy a patch of land down in Texas, hang up his guns, and forget he had ever spent a decade hunting his fellow man for coin. But Thorne wasn't just a thief. He was lethal. And for a man like that to risk exposing himself in a town controlled by Boone just to steal a sled of firewood for an outcast widow, it didn't fit the profile. It didn't fit the legend. "You're tracking him?" Miller asked, wiping fresh blood from his lip. "Mayor Boone is going to want his head on a spike." "Mayor Boone can get in line," Gideon replied coldly. He turned his back on the thug, walking toward the staircase that led to the rented rooms above. He needed his Winchester. He needed his snowshoes. "You ain't going out in that," the bartender called out, gesturing frantically to the rattling windows. "It's a whiteout. You'll freeze to death before you make it a quarter mile to the Vance property." Gideon paused at the base of the stairs. He looked at the frosted glass, listening to the shrieking wind. He hated the cold. He felt it deep in the bones of his knees, a lingering souvenir from the war. But Silas Thorne was out there, trapped by the same ice and snow. The board was set. "A man's got to earn his pay, barkeep," Gideon said quietly, and disappeared up the stairs. The fire was a living, breathing creature in the center of the cabin, radiating a thick golden heat that pushed the bitter cold back to the very edges of the log walls. Cora woke to the smell of brewing coffee and burning oak. For a terrifying, disorienting second, she didn't know where she was. The floorboards beneath her were hard, her back ached, and her woolen dress was twisted uncomfortably around her legs. Then, the memories of the previous night came rushing back with the force of an avalanche. The blizzard, the broken door, Silas collapsing, his body a map of blue ice and violent shivering. She remembered opening her dress. She remembered pressing herself against his bare, scarred back, offering him the only heat she had left to give. She remembered the terrifying, exhilarating moment when his shivering had stopped, and his large, calloused hand had covered hers, holding it flat against the steady, thundering beat of his heart. Cora sat up quickly, pulling her collar tight, her face flushing a deep, furious crimson. She was alone on the floor. "Morning!" The voice was a low, gravelly rasp that sent an involuntary shiver down Cora's spine. She snapped her head toward the small kitchen area. Silas Thorne was standing by the cast-iron stove. He looked battered, exhausted, and entirely too large for her small cabin. He was wearing his faded flannel shirt again, though it hung open, revealing the heavy muscles of his chest and the faded white lines of old violence. His dark hair was messy, falling into eyes that watched her with a quiet, intense awareness. He held a battered tin cup out to her, steam curled from the rim. "Found the coffee," Silas said mildly. "Hope you don't mind. I figure after you saved my life last night, I owe you at least a decent cup." Cora scrambled to her feet, her hands hastily smoothing down her wrinkled skirt, painfully aware of how disheveled she looked. You were freezing to death," she stammered, cursing her own breathlessness. "I did what any decent person would do." Silas's mouth twitched. the ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "Most decent folks in this town would have let the outlaw freeze, Mrs. Vance, and they would have slept soundly doing it." He walked over, his steps remarkably quiet for a man his size, and pressed the hot tin cup into her hands. His fingers brushed against hers. They were warm now, the burning heat of a man fully alive. Cora looked down at her coffee, unable to hold his piercing gaze. "Where is Lily?" "Still sleeping." Silas nodded toward the cot. Cora turned. Lily was buried beneath a mountain of blankets, topped by Silas's massive black duster. For the first time in weeks, the little girl's face wasn't pinched with pain or shivering. She was sleeping deeply, peacefully, a faint flush of healthy color returning to her pale cheeks. A lump formed in Cora's throat. She took a sip of the coffee. It was strong, black, and exactly what she needed. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice tight with emotion. "For the wood, for the coffee, for—" She gestured vaguely to the reinforced door, which Silas had somehow managed to completely rehinge and brace with heavy iron nails before she even woke. "Don't thank me yet," Silas said, turning away to stare out the frosted window. The whiteout conditions were absolute. There was no sky, no ground, only a swirling, chaotic vortex of snow. "Storm's not breaking. We're buried in here for at least another day, maybe 2. Cora stepped up beside him, keeping a cautious distance, but looking out at the same terrifying wall of white. "Boone won't send his men out in this." "No," Silas agreed, his eyes narrowing. "But Boone isn't the only thing hunting me. And the men who do what I do, they don't let a little snow stop them." He turned away from the window, his energy suddenly restless, coiled tight. Being trapped in a small space was wearing on him. He was a creature of the open plains, a man used to running, riding, moving. Confinement was a cage. "Your roof is leaking near the chimney," Silas noted, his gaze scanning the ceiling. "Snow's melting under the shingles, dripping down the masonry, going to rot the wood if it isn't patched." "I know," Cora sighed, setting her coffee down. "Daniel, my husband, was supposed to fix it before he died in the mine collapse. I've tried stuffing it with rags, but the draft keeps blowing them out." Silas didn't say a word. He walked over to the corner where Daniel's old tool chest sat gathering dust. He crouched down, his broad shoulders shifting under his open shirt as he rummaged through the iron tools, pulling out a hammer, some heavy nails, and a block of spare pine. "What are you doing?" Cora asked. "Paying my room and board," Silas replied. He grabbed a wooden chair, dragged it to the hearth, and stepped up onto it, reaching high above the stone mantel to inspect the rotting wood. For the next 2 hours, the cabin was filled with the rhythmic, heavy sound of hammering and the chopping of wood. Cora tried to busy herself. She made a meager breakfast of oatmeal and dried apples for Lily, who woke up with a brighter disposition than she'd had in a month. Lily sat by the fire, entirely captivated by the large, dangerous stranger who was fixing their broken house. But Cora found it entirely impossible to focus on her sewing. The heat inside the cabin had grown intense, trapped by the reinforced door and the roaring fire. Silas, working near the ceiling, was taking the brunt of it. After 30 minutes of driving nails into the stubborn frozen pine, he stopped. He let out a heavy breath, reached down, and pulled his flannel shirt off completely, tossing it over a nearby chair. Cora's needles stopped mid-stitch. She was a widow, a grown woman who had been married, but the sheer raw masculinity of the man standing on the chair sent a flush of pure, unadulterated heat straight to the roots of her hair. Silas Thorne was sculpted from hard labor and violence. His shoulders were impossibly broad, his back tapering down into a narrow waist. Sweat glistened on his skin, catching the firelight and turning his torso into a landscape of shifting bronze and shadow. Every time he swung the hammer, the heavy muscles of his back and arms coiled and released with mesmerizing, lethal power. He was magnificent, and he was terrifying. Cora stared at the jagged raised scar that slashed across his left shoulder blade, a deep groove that looked like it had been carved by a cavalry saber. She stared at the puckered bullet wound just above his right hip. She remembered exactly how that skin had felt against her own a few hours ago. "Stop it!" she scolded herself fiercely, jabbing the needle into the fabric of the dress she was mending so hard she pricked her thumb. She hissed, bringing the drop of blood to her lips. Silas stopped hammering. He looked over his shoulder, peering down at her from his perch. His dark eyes caught hers, and for a suspended, agonizingly long moment, the air in the cabin seemed to vanish. He knew she was watching him, and the dark, heavy hunger that flared in the depths of his eyes told her that he was acutely aware of her too. "You all right, Mrs. Vance?" he asked, his voice dropping an octave, turning rougher, darker. "Fine," Cora lied quickly, looking down at her sewing, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Just clumsy." Silas held her gaze a second longer, a muscle jumping in his jaw before he turned back to the roof. He swung the hammer harder this time. Too hard. As he reached awkwardly to drive a nail into a far corner, his foot slipped on the edge of the chair. He caught himself, his hands slamming against the rough stone of the chimney to arrest his fall. But the violent jerk of his body tore at something old and unhealed. Silas let out a sharp, guttural hiss of pain, dropping the hammer. It clattered loudly to the floor. He gripped his right side, his entire body going rigid. Cora was out of her chair before the hammer stopped rolling. "Silas!" He stepped down heavily, his face suddenly pale beneath his tan, his jaw locked tight. He was pressing his large hand against his right ribs, just below the bullet scar. When he pulled his hand away, his fingertips were slick with fresh, bright red blood. "Damn it," he muttered, his breath coming short. "Tore open an old graze, nothing serious." "Sit down," Cora commanded. It wasn't a request. The nurse, the mother, the survivor in her took absolute control. All the awkward romantic tension evaporated, replaced by immediate pragmatic action. "Sit on the cot, now." Silas looked like he wanted to argue, but the fierce, blazing authority in her dark eyes silenced him. The great, terrifying outlaw of the West gave a stiff nod and walked over to the edge of the cot, sitting down heavily. Lily watched with wide eyes from her spot on the rug. "Is he bleeding, Mama?" "Just a little, sweetheart," Cora said, her voice instantly softening to reassure her daughter. "Turn your face to the fire. Let Mama work." Cora rushed to the stove, pouring hot water from the kettle into an iron basin. She grabbed a cake of strong lye soap and tore a clean strip of white cotton from an old sheet. She walked over to Silas. He was staring at the floorboards, his chest heaving slightly, his pride clearly taking more of a hit than his ribs. Cora knelt on the floor between his parted knees. The intimacy of the position struck her for a second, but she pushed it aside. She dipped the rag into the hot water, lathered it with soap, and reached for his side. "Move your hand," she ordered softly. Silas slowly dropped his arm. The wound was a jagged tear, about 3 inches long, right along the rib cage. It looked like a knife wound that had been poorly stitched and had burst open under the strain of his heavy labor. "This is going to sting," Cora warned. "I've had worse," he grunted. She pressed the hot, soapy rag to the open flesh. Silas didn't make a sound, but his entire body went as taut as a steel cable. His massive hands gripped the edges of the cot so hard his knuckles turned white. Cora worked quickly, efficiently, cleaning away the blood and the dirt. She was so close to him she could feel the heat radiating off his skin, smell the intoxicating mix of pine, sweat, and danger that seemed to seep from his pores. Her fingers, gentle but firm, brushed against the hard planes of his stomach as she wiped away a stray trail of blood. Silas closed his eyes, his head falling back slightly, exposing the strong, corded column of his throat. He was breathing heavily, and it had absolutely nothing to do with the pain of the wound. "You push yourself too hard," Cora murmured, her voice dropping to a soft, intimate whisper as she leaned closer to inspect the tear. "You nearly froze to death last night. You shouldn't be swinging a hammer." "Don't know any other way to be," Silas rasped, his eyes remaining closed. Idle hands let the ghosts catch up. Cora paused, the bloody rag hovering over the basin. She looked up at his face. The harsh lines of his features were softened by exhaustion and the flickering firelight. In that moment, he didn't look like a killer. He looked like a man who was profoundly, fundamentally tired of running. "Who is chasing you, Silas?" she asked quietly. "The poster said murder. But last night, you looked at my daughter like she was the most precious thing in the world. You didn't look at her with fear. You looked at her with grief." Silas's eyes slowly opened. They were so dark, so filled with a bottomless, crushing sorrow that it stole the breath from Cora's lungs. He stared at her for a long time, the silence stretching between them, thick and heavy. "Her name was Sarah," Silas said, the words barely more than a breath. It was the first time he had spoken her name aloud to another living soul in 3 years. The sound of it felt like broken glass in his throat. She was 5, had hair the color of wheat, and eyes just like yours, actually. Dark, serious. Cora's hands stilled completely. She remained kneeling between his knees, entirely captivated by the raw, bleeding confession pouring from the hardened outlaw. "She got sick," Silas continued, staring past Cora into the fire. "Consumption, the doctor in town. He had the medicine, but it was expensive. I was just a ranch hand back then. Broke horses for pennies. I went to the bank, begged the owner for a loan against my future wages. I got down on my knees in the dirt outside his office and begged him." Silas's jaw locked, a muscle ticking furiously beneath the scar on his cheek. His hands flexed on the edge of the cot. "He laughed at me, told me he didn't finance dying stock. Said a man like me should just try again and make another one." Cora let out a soft gasp of horror, her hand instinctively reaching out, her wet fingertips resting gently on his uninjured hip to anchor him. "So," Silas whispered, his eyes coming back to focus on Cora's face, burning with a cold, terrifying fire. "I didn't try again. I put a bandana over my face, walked into his bank the next morning, and took the money at gunpoint." Did you kill him?" Cora asked, her voice trembling. "No," Silas said flatly. "I just took what I needed to save my little girl. But it took me 3 days to outrun the posse he sent after me. By the time I circled back to the cabin," his voice broke, a raw, devastating sound. "I was too late. She was gone. And my wife, she couldn't look at me anymore. Not after what I'd become. So I rode out. And I never stopped riding." Cora felt a hot tear slip down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She understood the blinding, suffocating desperation of watching a child fade away. She had lived it every day for the past 2 months with Lily. If someone had told her she could save Lily by robbing Mayor Boone, she would have pulled the trigger herself. "The banker," Cora said softly. "Who was he?" Silas looked at her, his eyes locking onto hers with terrifying intensity. "His name was Thaddeus Boone. Before he moved here and bought himself a mayoral title, he ran the banks in Colorado." Cora's blood froze. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. The man who had destroyed Silas's family was the exact same man who was currently starving her and her daughter to death. "He's a cancer," Silas said, his voice dropping to a lethal, vibrating pitch. "And he uses fear to control people. Just like he's using Lily's sickness to control this town, to steal your land, to run you out." "Daniel wouldn't sell," Cora whispered, the puzzle pieces finally locking together. "When the mine collapsed, Boone offered to buy this cabin and the acres behind it for pennies. I refused. That's when the rumors started about Lily's sickness being a curse. That's when the town turned on us. He wants the land, And he doesn't care who he has to bury to get it, Silas said. He leaned forward slightly. The distance between them vanished. Cora was kneeling, Silas was sitting, and their faces were suddenly inches apart. Cora could feel the heat of his breath against her lips. She could see the individual gold flecks in his dark eyes. The shared grief, the shared hatred of the man who had ruined them both, forged a sudden, unbreakable bond between them. A connection so intense it felt like a physical shock. Silas lifted his large, calloused hand from the cot. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his knuckles hovering near her face, before he gently reached out and wiped the single tear from her cheek with his thumb. His touch was impossibly soft. It was the touch of a man who cherished delicate things because he had destroyed so many of them. Cora's eyes fluttered shut. She leaned into his palm, an involuntary sigh escaping her lips. The desperate loneliness of the past year, the crushing weight of having to be strong every single second of every single day suddenly shattered. She wanted him to hold her. She wanted the terrifying outlaw to wrap his scarred arms around her and make the rest of the world disappear. Silas's gaze dropped to her mouth. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, sliding back to tangle in the loose copper strands of hair at the nape of her neck. He tilted her face up, leaning in closer, the air between them turning electric, heavy and undeniable. Cora's hands moved from his waist, sliding up the hard, ridged muscles of his chest, her fingers curling into his skin. He was going to kiss her, and she was going to let him. Crack! The sound was sharp, explosive, and came from right outside the cabin. It sounded like a heavy tree branch snapping under the weight of the ice. But Silas Thorne hadn't survived 3 years on the run by ignoring sounds. In a fraction of a second, the tender, vulnerable man vanished. The killer returned. Silas ripped himself away from Cora, his eyes wide and feral. He ignored the stinging pain in his side, grabbing his Colt from the table in a blur of motion, cocking the hammer as he lunged toward the frosted window. Cora fell back on her heels, her heart pounding in her throat, the ghost of his touch still burning on her skin. "What is it?" she gasped. Silas pressed his back against the log wall beside the window, peeking through a sliver of clear glass, his gun raised. Outside, the blizzard was still raging. But through the blinding white, a dark silhouette was moving steadily through the snowdrifts, heading straight for the cabin. The figure wasn't stumbling. It was walking with purpose, and it was carrying a rifle. "Get Lily," Silas ordered, his voice devoid of all emotion, cold and hollow as a grave. "Get her off the cot and get down on the floor behind the stove. Now." "Silas, who is it? Is it Boone's men?" "No," Silas said softly, his grip tightening on the heavy iron of the Colt. He recognized the steady, relentless stride of the man in the storm. He had seen it trailing him across 3 states. Worse. Gideon Cross had found them. The silhouette in the blizzard didn't draw a weapon. It didn't rush the cabin. Instead, the dark figure took 2 heavy, faltering steps onto the porch, swayed like a felled pine, and collapsed hard against the heavy oak of the reinforced door. Thud. Cora flinched, her arms instinctively wrapping tighter around Lily, who had crawled behind the cast-iron stove at Silas's command. Silas didn't blink. He stood pressed against the wall, his Colt .45 raised and steady, the hammer pulled back. The lethal calm had settled over him completely. He listened to the wind, waiting for the sound of boots flanking the cabin, waiting for the shout of Boone's men. Nothing came, only the relentless, screaming howl of the Wyoming winter. "Stay down," Silas murmured to Cora, his eyes never leaving the door. He moved with the silent, predatory grace of a panther, unwedging the heavy wooden chair with his left hand while keeping the gun leveled with his right. He nudged the door open just an inch with the toe of his boot. A body slumped inward, a cascade of snow spilling over the threshold with it. Silas kicked the door open wider, stepping back and aiming directly at the center of the fallen man's mass. But the man didn't move. He lay face down on the floorboards, a dusting of white covering a heavy, worn gray coat. Cora peeked out from behind the stove. "Is he dead?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Silas kept his gun trained on the man. Not yet. He recognized the gray coat. He recognized the custom-tooled leather gun belt, currently strapped to a man who was shivering violently. It was Gideon Cross, the most relentless, cold-blooded bounty hunter in the Western Territories. The man who had tracked Silas through the mud of Colorado and the blinding rains of the Dakotas. Silas stepped forward and kicked Gideon's right arm, sending the hunter's dropped Winchester skittering across the floor toward the hearth. Then, with the toe of his boot, Silas rolled the man over onto his back. Gideon's face was a ruin. The left side of his head was matted with dark, freezing blood from a deep gash near his temple. His lips were split and purple, his breath coming in shallow, rattling gasps. He hadn't been defeated by the storm. He had been beaten halfway to death before the storm ever got to him. "He's freezing," Cora said, her nurse's instinct overriding her fear as she saw the blue tinge of the man's skin. She started to stand up. "Don't touch him," Silas snapped, the sharpness of his tone freezing her in place. Silas stared down at the broken man who had haunted his every footstep for 8 months. The man who intended to put a bullet in his back and collect $5,000 from the very tyrant who had destroyed Silas's life. All Silas had to do was drag him back out onto the porch, shut the door, and let the Wyoming winter finish the job. It was the smart thing to do. It was the outlaw thing to do. He slowly lowered the barrel of the Colt, aiming it squarely between Gideon's eyes. It would be faster than the cold, more merciful even. Cora saw the shift in Silas's eyes, the utter terrifying emotional void of a killer making a calculation. She scrambled out from behind the stove, throwing herself between the barrel of the gun and the unconscious bounty hunter. "No!" she cried, holding her hands up. Silas's jaw clenched, his finger taut on the trigger. "Move, Cora. You don't know who this is. His name is Gideon Cross. He's a hunter, and I'm his prey. If he wakes up, he will kill me, and he won't care if you and the little bird are in the crossfire." "I don't care who he is," Cora shot back, her dark eyes blazing with a fierce, unwavering light. "I will not let you execute a helpless man on my floor, not in front of my daughter." Silas looked past her. Lily was peering out from behind the iron stove, her green eyes wide, clutching his black duster tightly around her small shoulders. She wasn't looking at Gideon. She was looking at Silas. And in her eyes there was no fear, only a profound, silent question. "Are you the monster they say you are?" Silas's breath hitched. The ghost of his own daughter seemed to stand in the shadows of the room, watching him. With a heavy, disgusted sigh, Silas slowly lowered the hammer of the Colt and holstered it. "You're a fool, Mrs. Vance," he grated, his voice thick with bitter resignation. "But it's your cabin." He reached down, grabbing Gideon roughly by the lapels of his frozen gray coat, and dragged the heavy man closer to the fire. "Get my saddlebags," Silas ordered. "There's a spool of heavy rawhide rope in the left pouch. We warm him up, but we tie him to the support beam. I'm not waking up with my throat slit." Cora didn't argue. She moved quickly, retrieving the rope while Silas systematically stripped Gideon of his weapons. A pair of matching Remington revolvers, a hunting knife in his boot, and a small derringer hidden in his vest pocket. The hunter was a walking armory. By the time Cora returned with a basin of warm water and a clean rag, Silas had Gideon securely bound to the heavy, load-bearing timber beam in the center of the cabin. His hands were tied behind the wood, the knots tight and professional. Cora knelt and began to clean the freezing blood from Gideon's temple. "This wasn't the storm," she noted quietly, inspecting the jagged edges of the wound. "Someone struck him. Hard. With the butt of a rifle, maybe." "Boone's men," Silas deduced, leaning against the stone hearth, his arms crossed over his chest. He watched Cora work with a mixture of dark brooding and quiet admiration. Cross must have been asking questions at the saloon. Boone doesn't like strangers sniffing around his town. They jumped him, took his horse, and left him in the snow to die. Gideon groaned, his head rolling to the side as the warm water touched his split skin. His slate-gray eyes fluttered, fighting through the haze of concussion and hypothermia. Slowly, the bounty hunter's vision cleared. He saw the flickering fire. He saw the beautiful copper-haired woman tending to his wounds. And then he saw the massive, scarred silhouette standing in the shadows of the hearth. Gideon's muscles instinctively jerked against the rawhide bindings, panic and adrenaline spiking through his battered body. "Save your strength, Cross," Silas said softly, stepping into the firelight. "Knots are wet. The more you pull, the tighter they get." Gideon slumped back against the timber beam, panting, a bloody, bitter smile twisting his lips. "Silas Thorne, you've got a habit of being exactly where you shouldn't be. And you have a habit of bleeding on floors that don't belong to you," Silas countered coldly. "Why are you here, Cross?" $5,000, Gideon wheezed, his eyes darting to Cora, assessing the situation. "Though I admit, the hospitality is a surprise. Figured you'd have put a bullet in my brain while I was out." "I wanted to," Silas admitted without a shred of hesitation. He nodded toward Cora. The lady objected. Gideon looked at Cora, really looked at her, noting the fierce set of her jaw and the protective way she occasionally glanced toward the back of the room. He followed her gaze and saw the little girl sitting quietly on the rug, a bald, fragile child swallowed by a massive outlaw duster. The bounty hunter's brow furrowed. The narrative he had been fed by the Pinkertons and the lawmen in 3 states didn't match the scene in front of him. A ruthless, child-killing train robber didn't sit out a blizzard playing house with a destitute widow and a sick kid. "Boone's men?" Silas pressed, bringing Gideon's attention back. "3 of them," Gideon confirmed, spitting a glob of blood onto the floor. "Jumped me behind the livery. They were agitated, talking about a ghost who broke Miller's nose and stole a sled of wood." Gideon's gray eyes locked onto Silas. "You're getting sloppy, Thorne. You exposed yourself for firewood?" "The girl was freezing," Silas said. "It wasn't a defense. It was a simple, immutable fact." Gideon stared at him, the gears turning in his concussed brain. "Boone knows you're here. Or at least he knows a man matching your description is here. When this storm breaks, he won't send 3 men. He'll send 20, and they'll burn this cabin to the ground with everyone inside." "Let them try," Silas whispered, his voice vibrating with a dark, lethal promise. He pushed off the hearth, walking over to Cora. He gently took the bloody rag from her trembling hands. "Go sit with Lily," he told her softly, the dangerous edge in his voice vanishing completely. "I'll keep watch." As Cora moved away, Gideon watched the exchange. He saw the way the widow looked at the outlaw, not with terror, but with a desperate, heavy trust. And he saw the way Silas looked back at her, like she was the only fixed point in a spinning, violent world. Gideon leaned his head back against the timber beam, closing his eyes against the throbbing pain in his skull. The hunt was over. But sitting in the suffocating tension of the small cabin, the seasoned bounty hunter realized with sinking dread that the war was just beginning. The blizzard raged into its second night, effectively burying the cabin under 4 feet of snow. Inside, the cabin had become a pressure cooker of trapped heat, lingering trauma, and unspoken desires. Gideon drifted in and out of a concussed sleep for most of the day. Whenever he opened his eyes, he observed a quiet domestic rhythm that entirely shattered his worldview. He watched Silas Thorne, the man with a $5,000 bounty for murder, sit on the floorboards with the bald, sickly child. Silas had taken his hunting knife, a blade Gideon knew had ended lives, and spent 2 hours meticulously whittling a small wooden horse from a scrap of oak for the girl. Lily hadn't shown a single ounce of fear. She had sat cross-legged, leaning against Silas's massive scarred arm, chattering away about the books her father used to read to her. Silas had listened to every word, his dark eyes softer than Gideon would have ever believed possible. The monster was a myth. Gideon had hunted a phantom constructed by Thaddeus Boone's lies. By nightfall, the cabin fell into a heavy, exhausted silence. Lily was fast asleep on the cot. Gideon, feigning sleep, watched through half-open eyes from his bindings at the timber pole. Silas was sitting by the hearth, stoking the embers. He had stripped off his flannel shirt again, the oppressive heat of the small room making the heavy wool unbearable. The firelight painted the brutal scars across his back and shoulders in stark relief, a roadmap of a life spent surviving. From the shadows near the kitchen area, Cora emerged. She had taken her hair down. The heavy copper waves cascaded over her shoulders, catching the golden light of the fire. She walked quietly over to the hearth, carrying a small tin cup of water, and sat on the floorboards beside Silas. Gideon held his breath. He was an intruder in a moment so private, so intensely charged, that the air in the cabin felt thick enough to cut with his knife. "You should sleep," Cora whispered, handing Silas the cup. Silas took it, his fingers brushing hers. He didn't drink. He just looked at her, the dark hunger from that morning returning to his eyes, tenfold. "Can't. You haven't slept in 2 days, Silas," she urged, her voice trembling slightly under the weight of his gaze. "Every time I close my eyes, I see Boone's men coming through that door," Silas rasped, setting the cup on the stone hearth. He turned his body fully toward her, his bare knee brushing against the heavy wool of her skirt. "I see them putting their hands on you. On Lily." Cora swallowed hard, the pulse jumping visibly at the base of her throat. "They won't. You're here." "I can't stay here forever, Cora." The words tore out of him, ragged and bitter. "You saw the poster. You know what I am. If I stay, I only bring the law down on your head. And if I leave—" He stopped, his jaw clenching so tight the muscle jumped beneath his scar. "If I leave, Boone will kill you to get this land." "Then don't leave," Cora whispered. The words hung in the suffocating heat of the cabin, fragile but fiercely defiant. Silas stared at her, his chest rising and falling heavily. "Cora, do not ask me that. You don't know what you're asking. I'm a ghost. I'm violence and blood and running in the dark. I have nothing to give you but a shallow grave." "I don't care." Cora closed the distance between them. She reached out, her small, soft hands pressing flat against the hard, scarred expanse of his chest. She felt the frantic, thundering beat of his heart beneath her palms. "I have spent the last year being terrified," Cora said, her voice breaking, tears shining in her dark eyes. "Terrified of the cold, terrified of the town, terrified of losing my daughter. The only time I haven't been afraid was when you walked through that door." Silas let out a jagged breath, his hands coming up to hover over her arms, wanting to touch her, terrified to ruin her. "Cora, you are not a monster, Silas Thorne," she whispered fiercely, sliding her hands up to cup his face, her thumbs tracing the harsh line of his jaw, brushing over the scar on his brow. "You are the man who saved my little girl. You are the man who bled to keep us warm. You are a good man, good man." The words shattered the last iron vault inside Silas's soul. The dam broke. With a low, desperate groan, Silas buried his hands in her thick copper hair and pulled her to him. The kiss was an explosion. It wasn't gentle. It was hungry, bruising, and born of years of starvation. It was a man drowning in the dark who had finally found air. Cora gasped against his mouth, her hands tangling in his dark hair, pulling him closer, anchoring him to the earth. Silas shifted, his massive frame looming over her as he pressed her gently backward onto the soft rug before the hearth. His mouth never left hers. He tasted like coffee, danger, and a desperate, beautiful sorrow. His calloused hands swept down the curve of her spine, pulling her flush against the hard, burning heat of his body. Cora responded with a fierce, answering fire. All the grief, all the loneliness, all the suppressed terror of the past year poured into the kiss. She opened her mouth to him, whimpering softly as his tongue swept inside, claiming her with a possessive, overwhelming heat that melted the last of her defenses. Silas tore his mouth away, trailing hot, open-mouthed kisses down the line of her jaw, pressing his lips to the frantic pulse at her throat. "I won't let him touch you," Silas swore against her skin, his voice a ragged, breathless vow that echoed over the crackle of the fire. "I swear to God, Cora, I will burn Blackwood to the ground before I let Boone put a hand on you or that little girl." Cora tangled her fingers in his hair, pulling his face back up to hers, her eyes blazing with a fierce frontier survivalist's fire. "Then we fight him," she breathed, pulling his lips back down to hers. "Together." Across the room, bound to the timber pole in the shadows, Gideon Cross silently closed his eyes. He had hunted Silas Thorne for the bounty. But as he listened to the desperate, hushed whispers of the outlaw and the widow in the firelight, the bounty hunter realized he was no longer a hunter. He was a witness to a man finding something worth dying for. And when the snow cleared, Gideon knew he was going to have to make a choice about whose side of the gun he wanted to be on. The third morning broke with a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. The howling wind that had battered the cabin for 48 hours had simply vanished, leaving behind a world buried beneath a pristine, blindingly white ocean of snow. The sky above Blackwood was a crisp, fragile blue. But Silas Thorne knew better than to trust the quiet. He was standing by the frosted window before the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridge, his body tense, his eyes scanning the tree line. Cora was beside the hearth, stirring a meager pot of oats, while Lily slept peacefully under the heavy duster. Tied to the timber pole, Gideon Cross was wide awake, watching Silas with the sharp, calculating eyes of a predator who realized the ecosystem had just shifted. "They're coming," Silas said. His voice was a flat, dead calm that sent a spike of pure ice straight down Cora's spine. She dropped the wooden spoon and rushed to his side, peering through the small patch of clear glass he had rubbed into the frost. Struggling through the waist-deep snowdrifts on the main road were 12 men on horseback. They were bundled in heavy furs, moving slowly but with terrifying purpose. And even in the bright morning light, Cora could see the flickering, unnatural orange glow they carried. Torches, pitch-soaked and burning hot. "They aren't coming to talk," Gideon noted grimly from his bindings, having heard the crunch of the horses' hooves. "Boone's done playing games. He's going to claim the sicknesses in the wood of the cabin. He's going to burn it to the ground to purify the land." "With us inside," Cora whispered, the blood draining from her face. She looked back at her sleeping daughter. "Oh, God, Lily." "Get the girl," Silas ordered, his voice snapping like a whip. "Wrap her in the heaviest blankets you have. Put her boots on." Silas didn't hesitate. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, pulling his hunting knife from his belt. He grabbed Gideon by the collar of his gray coat and sliced through the thick rawhide binding the bounty hunter's wrists to the pole. Gideon stumbled forward, rubbing his raw wrists, his slate-gray eyes wide with shock. "You're cutting me loose?" "I can't shoot 12 men and carry a child at the same time," Silas growled, turning to the table where he had piled Gideon's confiscated weapons. He picked up the twin Remingtons and shoved them into Gideon's chest. "You want to live, Cross? You earn it. Cover our backs." Gideon caught the heavy revolvers, the familiar weight of the steel grounding him. He looked at the wanted killer who had just handed him loaded guns, then at the terrified widow rushing to bundle her sickly child. "I'm on your left, Thorne," Gideon said, spinning the cylinders and locking them into place. Outside, the sound of shouting shattered the morning. "Burn the plague!" a voice roared. Miller, his voice still nasal from his broken nose. "Boone says leave no trace of the witch or her cursed brat." The first torch hit the roof. The pine shingles, though cold, were bone dry underneath the snowpack. The pitch and oil caught instantly, sending a terrifying whoosh of flame across the ceiling. Within seconds, thick, acrid black smoke began to seep through the rotting gaps Silas had tried to patch the day before. Lily woke up coughing, her green eyes wide with terror as the ceiling above them began to crackle and glow. "Mama!" she shrieked. "I've got you, my sweet girl, I've got you." Cora cried, scooping the bundled child into her arms. To the back door! Eto, Silas yelled over the roar of the flames. The heat in the cabin was suddenly unbearable, the air turning into a suffocating gray fog. Cora, there's an old silver mine up the ridge about a half-mile deep into the pines. Can you find it? Yes, Daniel used to take me there. She coughed, her eyes streaming with tears from the smoke. Run straight for it. Do not look back. Do not stop. Silas stepped in front of her, his massive frame shielding both mother and child. He looked at Gideon. Ready? Kick it, Gideon said, raising his Remingtons. Silas drove his heavy boot into the back door, shattering the latch and sending the wood flying outward into a snowdrift. The cold air rushed in, feeding the fire above them, but clearing the smoke just enough for them to burst out onto the back porch. They're coming out the back, someone yelled from the side of the cabin. Gunfire erupted. The deafening crack, crack, crack of rifles tore through the frozen morning. Wood splintered all around them. Silas fired his Colt in a blindingly fast sequence, dropping the first two men who rounded the corner of the cabin. Gideon stepped out beside him, his twin Remingtons barking lethal fire, forcing the rest of Boone's men to dive for cover behind the snow-covered woodpile. Run, Cora, go! Silas roared, pushing her off the porch into the deep snow of the tree line. Cora ran. She waded through the waist-high drifts, her lungs burning. Holding Lily so tightly to her chest, her arms ached. The sound of bullets snapping through the pine branches above her head was the most terrifying sound she had ever heard. But Silas's voice echoed in her mind. Do not look back. Silas and Gideon backed away slowly, laying down a relentless wall of lead. The cabin behind them was fully engulfed now, a towering inferno of orange and black against the pristine white snow. One of Boone's men, armed with a Winchester, climbed up onto a nearby stump for a better angle. He aimed straight for the fleeing woman in the trees. Silas saw the barrel track toward Cora. With a roar of pure animalistic fury, Silas threw himself into the line of fire. He fired his Colt, taking the sniper directly in the chest, but he was a fraction of a second too late to avoid the return fire. The rifle cracked. Silas felt a massive, brutal impact tear through his right shoulder just below the collarbone. It felt like being kicked by a draft horse. The force of the heavy .44 caliber slug spun him around, dropping him to his knees in the blood-stained snow. "Thorn!" Gideon yelled, firing his last 3 rounds to keep the remaining men pinned down behind the burning cabin. Silas gritted his teeth, a low groan tearing from his throat. His right arm hung useless, his Colt slipping from his numb fingers. He grabbed the gun with his left hand, forcing himself back to his feet through sheer, unadulterated willpower. "I'm up," Silas grunted, blood already pouring down the front of his flannel shirt, steaming in the freezing air. "Move, Cross! Move!" They plunged into the dense, dark sanctuary of the pine forest, leaving the burning remains of Cora's life behind them. The abandoned silver mine was little more than a jagged black scar in the side of the mountain, hidden behind a thick curtain of frozen weeping willows. It was freezing, damp, and smelled of wet stone and old earth. But it was out of the wind, and more importantly, it was out of sight. Cora collapsed onto the rocky floor of the cave, her chest heaving, sobbing uncontrollably as she pulled Lily from the blankets. The little girl was terrified but unharmed, her bald head perfectly intact, her green eyes wide as she clung to her mother's neck. A moment later, the brush at the cave entrance parted. Gideon stumbled in, supporting the massive weight of Silas Thorne. "Silas!" Cora screamed, her heart stopping completely. Silas was deathly pale, his jaw locked in a rictus of agony. The entire right side of his body was drenched in bright arterial blood. He took 2 steps into the cave before his knees buckled entirely. Gideon couldn't hold him, and the great outlaw crashed heavily onto the unforgiving stone floor. "Get him on his back," Cora ordered, her panic instantly converting into the cold, clinical focus of a frontier woman. She scrambled across the dirt, pushing Gideon aside. She tore open Silas's bloody shirt. The bullet had entered just below his collarbone and exited cleanly through the back of his shoulder. It was a through and through, but it was bleeding profusely. "Tear my petticoat," Cora commanded Gideon, not even looking up. "The clean white linen underneath. Hurry!" Gideon drew his hunting knife, slicing a massive strip of clean fabric from the hem of Cora's undergarments, handing it to her. Cora folded the linen into a thick pad and pressed it violently against the entry wound, using her other hand to reach beneath his back to apply pressure to the exit. Silas let out a choked, guttural roar of pain, his back arching off the stone floor, his eyes rolling back in his head. I know. I'm sorry," Cora wept, her tears falling freely now, landing on his blood-soaked chest. She leaned her entire body weight onto her hands, pressing down on the wound to staunch the flow. "Don't you dare die on me, Silas Thorne. Do you hear me? You promised you wouldn't leave us. You promised." Silas's chest heaved. He forced his dark, heavy eyes to focus on her face. Even through the blinding haze of pain, his left hand came up, his trembling, blood-stained fingers weakly grasping her wrist. "Takes more than a piece of lead to kill a ghost, Cora," he rasped, forcing the ghost of a smirk onto his pale lips. Cora let out a broken sob, dropping her forehead against his chest right over his heart. "You reckless, stupid man," she cried, all her defenses utterly shattered. "I can't lose you. I can't bury another man I love. I won't do it." The words echoed in the damp cavern. "Another man I love." Silas's hand slid from her wrist to tangle in her copper hair. He closed his eyes, a profound, overwhelming peace settling over his battered features. He had lived 3 years believing he was entirely unlovable, a monster fit only for the dark. And here, bleeding out on the floor of a freezing cave, he had finally found the light. "I'm not going anywhere, Cora," he whispered fiercely. "I'm right here." Standing a few feet away, watching the profound, raw intimacy of the scene, Gideon Cross felt the last remnants of his bounty hunter's pride crumble to dust. He walked over to the mouth of the cave, making sure they weren't being followed. When he was satisfied the snow was covering their tracks, he walked back to the small fire he had just sparked with flint and dry moss. Gideon reached into his heavy gray coat. He pulled out the folded, yellowed wanted poster that had been his holy grail for 8 months. Silas Thorne. Reward, $5,000 for armed robbery and murder. Gideon stared at it for a long moment, then dropped it into the small flames. The paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash. "You didn't kill that guard on the Union Pacific train, Thorne," Gideon said suddenly, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet cave. Silas's eyes snapped open. Cora looked up, her hands still pressing hard against the bandages. "I know," Silas grated, wincing as a fresh wave of pain hit him. "I fired into the air, took the payroll box and rode off. I never shot anyone." "Boone's men did," Gideon revealed, stepping fully into the firelight, his slate-gray eyes locking onto Silas. "I'm not just a bounty hunter, Thorne. Before I took up the badge for coin, I was a Pinkerton, and I still have friends in the agency. I started digging into Thaddeus Boone 2 months ago." Cora frowned, confused. "Why?" "Because he's doing this everywhere," Gideon explained, crouching down beside them. "Boone didn't just deny your loan, Thorne. He's been denying loans, calling in debts, and using his hired thugs to run people off their land across 3 counties. He's buying up the territory for pennies." "For what?" Cora asked, her voice tight. "The railroad," Gideon said. "The Union Pacific is planning a new northern spur. They need a right-of-way through this valley. Boone knows exactly where the tracks are going to be laid. Your cabin, Mrs. Vance? It sits dead center on the proposed route. He needs your land to complete the corridor. He stands to make millions." Silas let out a dark, humorless laugh that turned into a bloody cough. "So he frames me for murder to ensure I hang instead of talk, and he burns widows out of their homes to build a train track. He had his own man shoot the train guard to justify putting a $5,000 dead or alive bounty on your head," Gideon confirmed. He knew a bounty that high would bring every gun in the West down on you. He wanted you silenced. Cora looked down at Silas. The man the world thought was a monster was actually just a grieving father who had been used as a scapegoat by a tyrant. Her heart ached with a love so fierce and protective it took her breath away. "We can't just run," Cora said, her voice dropping to a low, deadly register that surprised both men. She looked from Silas to Gideon. "My husband died in that man's mine. He starved my daughter. He burned my home. And he shot the man I love." She gently tied off the makeshift bandage around Silas's shoulder, her hands stained with his blood. She sat back on her heels, her dark eyes burning with the fire of a frontier reckoning. "I'm not running anymore," Cora stated flatly. "I want Thaddeus Boone destroyed." Gideon looked at the copper-haired widow, then down at the bleeding, scarred outlaw who was staring at her like she was the queen of the earth. A slow, grim smile finally touched the bounty hunter's eyes. "Well then, Mrs. Vance," Gideon said, drawing his twin Remingtons and checking the cylinders. "When the storm fully clears tomorrow, we're going to go to town and introduce the mayor to the ghosts he created." The morning sun over Blackwood was blinding, reflecting off the pristine, waist-deep snow that choked the valley. But the glaring light offered no warmth. Silas Thorne walked down the dead center of the main street, every step a brutal negotiation with his own failing body. Underneath his heavy duster, the right side of his flannel shirt was a stiff, dark mass of dried blood. He couldn't lift his right arm past his waist, the muscle and tissue completely torn by the rifle slug. But in his left hand, resting loosely against his thigh, he held the heavy iron of his Colt .45. The town was dead quiet. Faces pressed against the frosted glass of the general store, the livery, and the saloon. The people of Blackwood. The same people who had stood by while a widow and her sick child were driven into the cold. Watched in terrified silence as the ghost they thought had burned in the night came walking out of the white wasteland. From the swinging doors of the saloon, Mayor Thaddeus Boone stepped out onto the boardwalk. Boone was a man dressed for the civilized East, wearing a tailored wool suit and a bowler hat, his pristine boots contrasting sharply with the mud and snow of the frontier. Flanking him were Miller and 5 other hired guns, their Winchesters raised and trained squarely on Silas's chest. "Well," Boone called out, a cruel, mocking smile spreading across his manicured face, "I was told the plague rat's nest burned to the ash it deserved, but it seems a rat managed to crawl out of the fire." Silas stopped 20 yards away. The wind caught the hem of his duster, snapping it like a dark flag. His face was ash-pale, coated in a cold sweat, but his dark eyes burned with an inferno that made Boone's men nervously shift their weight. "The fire didn't take Boone," Silas rasped, his voice scraping across the frozen street like a rusted blade. "And neither did the bullet. But I'm here to collect on both." Boone laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. "You're bleeding out in the street, Thorne. You have a $5,000 bounty on your head for robbing my train and killing my guard. And you think you're in a position to collect? Shoot him, Miller." Miller raised his rifle. "Wait!" The scream tore through the morning air, freezing the blood in Silas's veins. From the alleyway beside the saloon, 2 more of Boone's thugs dragged Cora Vance out into the snow. She was fighting like a wildcat, her copper hair loose and flying, her fingernails clawing at the men holding her arms. But they overpowered her. Silas's heart stopped. No. He had told her to stay in the cave with Lily. He had told Gideon to keep her there. But Cora Vance was not a woman who let the men she loved walk into the fire alone. Boone's eyes lit up with malicious delight. He stepped down off the boardwalk, pulling a silver-plated derringer from his vest pocket. He walked over to Cora, grabbed her roughly by the jaw, and pressed the muzzle of the small, deadly gun directly against her temple. "Well, well," Boone purred. "The widow, how poetic. Drop the gun, Thorne, or I paint the snow with her brains." Silas didn't breathe. The world tunneled down to the cold steel pressed against the head of the woman who had saved his life, the woman who had kissed him in the dark. and made him feel human again. "Let her go, Boone," Silas said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, lethal whisper. "This is between you and me." "It's about the land, Silas," Boone shouted, the veneer of the civilized mayor slipping to reveal the greedy tyrant underneath. "It was always about the land. The railroad is coming right through her living room. I needed her gone, and you just had to play the hero, just like you did 5 years ago when you came begging for a loan for your dying brat." Cora gasped, tears of absolute fury spilling down her cheeks as she glared at the man who had orchestrated so much death. "I had my own man shoot that train guard, Thorne," Boone sneered, intoxicated by his own absolute power, completely confident that no one in this cowed town would ever stand against him. "I put the bounty on you to ensure you'd hang if you ever showed your face again. And now I get to kill you, kill the widow, and blame it all on a desperate outlaw resisting arrest." Boone pulled back the hammer on the derringer. "Drop the gun, Thorne. Now!" Silas's hands shook. He looked at Cora. Her dark eyes were wide, but she gave a frantic, nearly imperceptible shake of her head. "Don't do it." But Silas would burn the whole world down before he let a bullet touch her. Slowly, his fingers opened. The heavy Colt dropped into the snow with a dull thud. Boone's smile widened into a triumphant, ugly sneer. "Miller, put him down." Miller smirked, aiming his Winchester squarely at Silas's heart, his finger tightening on the trigger. Crack! The gunshot echoed like a cannon blast, but Silas didn't fall. Instead, Thaddeus Boone shrieked in sudden, high-pitched agony. The silver derringer spun wildly out of his hand, along with 2 of his fingers in a spray of crimson. Cora instantly dropped to the snow, covering her head. From the roof of the general store, a figure stood up against the blinding blue sky. Gideon Cross racked the lever of his Winchester, the smoking barrel still pointed perfectly at the mayor. But he was no longer wearing the ragged gray coat of a desperate bounty hunter. His coat was open and pinned squarely over his heart. Catching the morning sun in a brilliant flash of silver was a heavy star-shaped badge. "Deputy United States Marshal Gideon Cross," his voice boomed over the street, carrying the absolute, uncompromising weight of federal law. "Lay down your weapons. Every man holding a gun for Thaddeus Boone is under federal arrest for conspiracy, murder, and extortion." Panic instantly shattered Boone's ranks. The thugs looked from the bleeding mayor on his knees, to the federal marshal on the roof, to the deadly outlaw standing in the street. Miller hesitated, swinging his rifle toward the roof. It was the last mistake he ever made. Silas didn't bother picking up his Colt. With a blindingly fast, fluid motion of his left hand, he drew the heavy hunting knife from his belt and threw it. The blade spun through the freezing air and buried itself to the hilt in Miller's shoulder, dropping the massive thug screaming into the snow. Gideon fired a warning shot that shattered the wooden post inches from another thug's head. "I said drop them!" The remaining men threw their rifles into the mud and raised their hands, their loyalty to Boone evaporating. The second federal lead started flying. Boone was on his knees, clutching his mangled hand to his chest, his face completely bloodless as he stared at the marshal. You were a bounty hunter," he stammered in shock. "I was under cover, you greedy son of a bitch," Gideon growled, climbing down the ladder at the side of the store and striding into the street, a pair of heavy iron cuffs jingling in his hand. "And you just confessed to federal crimes in front of half the town. You're going to hang, Boone, and I'm going to pull the lever myself." Silas didn't care about Boone. He stumbled forward, his strength completely failing him, and dropped to his knees in the snow beside Cora. She threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in the uninjured side of his chest, sobbing violently into his duster. Silas wrapped his left arm around her, burying his face in her copper hair, breathing in the scent of lye soap and lavender that had kept him alive through the darkest night of his life. "I told you to stay in the cave," he murmured, his voice thick with exhaustion and overwhelming relief. Cora pulled back, her hands cupping his pale, blood-stained face. Her dark eyes were fierce, blazing with a love so absolute it outshone the Wyoming sun. I'm done hiding, Silas Thorne, she wept, pressing her forehead against his. And so are you. We are entirely done hiding, 6 months later. The Wyoming winter, with its teeth of ice and suffocating whiteout blizzards, was nothing more than a ghost memory. The valley of Blackwood was bathed in the golden honeyed light of late June. The snow had melted away, revealing sweeping meadows of emerald grass and vibrant bursts of purple lupine and yellow arrowleaf balsam root. The sound of hammering echoed across the valley, but it wasn't the frantic, desperate pounding of a man trying to keep out the cold. It was the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of a man building a future. Cora Vance stood on the porch of the newly framed two-story house, wiping her hands on her flour-dusted apron. The air smelled of fresh-cut pine, sweet grass, and the apple pie baking in her new cast-iron stove. She looked out across the meadow. The Union Pacific Railroad had indeed laid its tracks, but they ran a full mile to the north. Thaddeus Boone was currently rotting in a federal penitentiary in Colorado, awaiting the gallows. When the railroad executives had arrived to negotiate the right-of-way, they found themselves sitting across a table from Deputy Marshal Gideon Cross and a very uncompromising widow. Cora had sold the original cabin site for a small fortune, more money than she had ever seen in her life, and used it to buy 200 acres of prime, untouched pasture on the southern edge of the valley. But the land wasn't the most beautiful thing Cora looked at. Down by the meandering creek, a little girl was chasing a painted butterfly. Lily's laughter rang out, clear and bright as a silver bell, and she was no longer bald. Soft, thick curls of vibrant copper, the exact shade of her mother's hair, framed Lily's flushed, healthy face. The sickness was completely gone, taking the town's cruel superstitions with it. "Don't run too fast, little bird, you'll spook the horses." Silas Thorne walked up from the creek bank, carrying a massive load of split fence posts over his right shoulder. The shoulder had healed perfectly, leaving a wicked, puckered scar, but stealing none of his strength. He was shirtless in the summer heat, his skin baked a deep bronze by the sun, the old scars of his violent past fading into the landscape of a man at peace. He dropped the timber near the fence line and wiped the sweat from his brow, catching Lily as she launched herself at his legs. He hoisted the little girl up, tossing her into the air and catching her with a deep, booming laugh that made Cora's heart flutter in her chest exactly the way it had the first night they met. Silas set Lily down and sent her to check on the barn cats, then turned his gaze up the hill toward the porch. When he saw Cora, the outlaw's swagger vanished, replaced by a devastatingly soft, possessive warmth. He walked up the grassy slope, his boots silent on the earth. He stepped onto the porch, towering over her, smelling of sun-warmed skin, pine sap, and honest labor. "You're staring, missus. You're staring." "Thorne," Silas murmured, a wicked, lazy smirk touching the corner of his mouth as he reached out to wipe a smudge of flour from her cheek with his thumb. Cora leaned into his calloused palm, turning her face to press a soft kiss into the center of his hand. Thanks to Gideon's relentless digging and federal testimony regarding Boone's corruption, the territorial governor had granted Silas a full, unconditional pardon. The dead or alive posters had been torn down. The bounty was gone. Silas was a free man, and 3 months ago, in a quiet ceremony overseen by a traveling preacher, he had made Cora his wife. "I'm just thinking," Cora whispered, sliding her arms around his narrow waist, resting her head against the solid, thundering drum of his chest. "About how far we've come since the snow." Silas's arms wrapped around her, pulling her flush against his hard body. He buried his face in the thick waves of her copper hair, closing his eyes as a profound, overwhelming sense of gratitude washed over him. He had spent 3 years believing his life ended the day he buried his first daughter. He had believed he was a monster, a ghost condemned to wander the freezing dark until a bullet finally put him out of his misery. But then he had heard a child scream in the snow, and he had stopped. I was a dead man walking, Cora, Silas whispered fiercely, his voice vibrating against her ear. Until you opened that door and let the fire in. Cora pulled back slightly, her dark eyes looking up into the face of the most dangerous man in the West. The man who belonged entirely, irreversibly, to her. You were never dead, Silas, she smiled, reaching up to trace the faded scar through his eyebrow. You were just waiting for spring. Silas let out a ragged breath. He bent his head, capturing her lips in a deep, slow, and consuming kiss that tasted of sunshine, survival, and a promise that would never be broken. Out in the meadow, the wind blew through the tall green grass, warm and gentle. The storm was over, the ghost was gone, and the cowboy had finally come home.